Happy Tuesday, 6th grade, ready to get into lesson 1 about science as we talk about reproduction this chapter and how God has a beautiful plan to making sure this planet keeps going until he decides to come back and get us. Today we're talking what is asexual reproduction, and the summary little paragraph from the lesson reads this. During asexual reproduction, a parent passes inherited traits to its offspring. An organism's inherited traits and environment work together to develop its characteristic. Learned traits are not passed from parent to offspring. We're going to cover all that in this first paragraph here, guys. It's talking about what makes you, or is specific, or in general, just what makes a plant, an animal, anything the way they are. There's a number of things that come together to do those things. So this first paragraph is more what heredity is, and then the next 2 pages as we work through our lesson will be more toward what asexual reproduction is. Hopefully you got your notes sitting on your desk and you're ready to go. If the baboons in the picture were grouped with other kinds of animals, you could easily tell which parents belonged with which offspring. Heredity is the passing of traits from parents to their offspring. You got your notes. Because parents and offspring share traits, they resemble each other. Number 2 in your notes. An organism may grow to be bigger, smaller, lighter, darker than its parents, but the basic pattern is the same. Oak trees make acorns, which grow to become oak trees, not maple trees. So guys, what they're saying here is heredity in general is you're going to look somewhat like your parents. They might be some differences, but in general, you're going to continue to resemble where you came from. We'll talk about some things that can make some differences in that, but this is just generally speaking how those things work. Number 3, all organisms inherit traits. That's what heredity is, guys. You inherit. You see the word inherit and the root word in heredity, so that you get that. Heredity is the reason bacteria have a certain shape, or they absorb certain chemicals, because their offspring, their parents did it. Heredity gives a tiger stripes and a leopard spots, and it's never the other way around. Do you have dimples? What color are your eyes? These are just a few of the traits that humans inherit, and many times, depending on what we're going to learn later on, it probably won't be till next week, will be if you have a dominant trait that shows up in your body, your parents have that dominant trait, then it passes on to you as you get those things, guys. So bacteria are going to be able to absorb the same chemicals. Why? Because they come from bacteria that did that. My parents had blue eyes, I have blue eyes, my kids have blue eyes. It's one trait that gets passed down to it. Now that's not always guaranteed that way, guys, as we're going to learn, but in general that's how it works. Inherited traits do not act alone to give an organism its traits. Environment also affects characteristics. Heredity and environment work together to produce a tree's height. So guys, up here we talked the same thing. Remember that? Where we talked about inherited traits and environment working together. They're going to give you an example in trees now. For example, a tree may inherit the ability to grow 12 meters tall. However, if the tree doesn't get the nutrients it needs, it probably will not grow to 12 meters tall. Okay, so over here in your notes here it says environment, they work together, but environment also affects its characteristics. So they gave you an example of a tree, which is a good one. What it inherited from its parents says you have the ability, you should grow 12 meters tall, but it grows in a time of great drought, bad nutrients, boom, it doesn't get that tall. The same thing could be with humans, guys. Sometimes kids might not be as tall, or they might be taller than their parents because 1, genes can vary what they inherit, but 2, the nutrition might be different. I might not eat healthy. If I don't eat healthy, I might not grow to my full potential. And so all those things are getting in there. So my environment, you can see environment affecting a lot more plants easily, whether it's plenty of rain or not enough rain, or enough sunlight or not enough sunlight, or good soil or bad soil. All those easily you can see how the environment affects that. But guys, it's true with humans as well. Okay, third thing. Organisms also have traits that they don't inherit. Perhaps you are good at basketball. Heredity may have given you athletic ability. Even so, you still had to practice playing the game. Playing basketball well is a learned trait. Learned traits cannot pass from parent to offspring through heredity. Okay, so I'm going to jump to the summary here. You are who you are for 3 reasons. 1, heredity. What did you inherit from your parents? 2, environment. How did your environment affect the characteristics that you came up with? And then C, what are your learned traits? So now they gave you an example in here about basketball. What they're saying is you might have inherited your height from your parents. Maybe you're tall and that helps you with basketball. Your parents might be very athletic, which means they can run, jump. They're not clumsy. They don't trip and fall over their own feet. They're graceful. We like sometimes say, man, he's smooth when he or she plays the game. Those are inherited traits. You're athletic. Now you have your environment. And that is, how does that impact, in this example, basketball? So I'll give you an example from my life. Both my parents were college basketball players, okay? So they weren't tall, but they were athletic. They could shoot the ball really well. Where I grew up at my house, my own personal house, when I was growing up, had 4 basketball hoops on it, including a full court. So we had a long driveway, and what we did is we took that long driveway and we added it and made it wide, and then put 2 hoops at each end, where my driveway was literally like the gym at Garden Homes. We could play basketball. So my environment helped me develop my basketball skills because there were basketball hoops everywhere. I didn't, might have had athletic parents, but if there's no hoops to shoot at, that doesn't do me any good. My parents are both teachers, which said anytime they went to school, I could go to school with them and shoot at the gym at the school, which I was able to do. My dad ran basketball camps, and he would let me come from a young age to those basketball camps. That's all the environment that's helping develop it. Okay, but what it's getting down to, guys, is despite the fact that my parents were athletic and I lived at a house that had 4 basketball hoops, including a full court where I could play every day, I decided I didn't like basketball and I never dribbled it. Okay, my learned traits would say you're not going to be good at basketball because I never learned how to dribble. I never learned how to shoot. I never learned how to do all those things. So you think about the basketball stars in the NBA today, and they have kids. Their kids aren't going to come out and be 2-year-old basketball phenoms. That is a trait they have to learn through practice. And guys, we have to understand, I like to just use fractions. 1/3 is what did you inherit from your parents, 1/3 is how does the environment that you live in affect it, and 1/3 is what do you spend your time learning. Okay, we can't learn everything. There's too much out there in the world. So some of you might spend a lot of time learning sports and you're good at sports. Some of you might spend a lot of time learning academics, and so you might be very good at school. Some of you might spend time with the arts, whether it's singing, dancing, drawing, things like that. That would be your learned traits. Some of us can do a wide variety of those, guys, but you understand what we're getting at on learned traits play a huge role of it. I have to be able to practice those things if I want to be good at it. So in general, this is not just for humans, guys. This is for any living thing. We have to understand that. Now, obviously, the learned traits are going to change when we think about other things. I don't think about plants learning too many things, but animals obviously adapt and learn as they go through. Okay, turn the page if you're in your books. Moving on to the next stage for us if we're over here as we take on the rest of the lesson, learning about what asexual reproduction is. Individual organisms do not live forever. For that reason, the passing of traits from parent to offspring is necessary in order for a species to survive. Okay, where do they have to survive? A parent might have traits that help it survive in its environment. These traits can be passed to offspring so that they too can successfully live and reproduce. And so what we're talking about, guys, is your science book's going to do a good job of not talking just humans. They're going to talk microscopic bacteria all the way up to plants and animals to make sure we understand that. But parents are going to learn things, they're going to pass on to their offspring that helps them survive in a certain environment, whether that's cold or hot, wet or dry. If they figured out how to live in the environment, they're hoping passing that traits on to the next generation. The organisms shown on these pages are producing new individuals. Although the process they may use seem different, each is doing so by asexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, offspring come from a single, one parent. Organisms reproduce asexually through the process called mitosis, which we talked about last chapter, the splitting of cells. The offspring will have the same DNA as their parents. you might want to use not only the word same, but identical. So they will be identical to their parents, guys. I like to take the A off this. A means one. I have a hat. I have a pencil. I have a one. So that's why we have it here. Asexual offsprings come from one parent. They'll have identical or the same DNA as they split. Now the rest of this is just going to talk about the different ways or the different kinds of asexual reproduction. Some organisms, such as bacterium, that's singular, bacteria is plural, that's usually what we say. Bacterium on this page reproduce when a parent cell splits to produce two offspring cells of the same size. Each offspring cell has the same traits as the parent cell. This kind of asexual reproduction is called fission. It often is a fast way to reproduce. Think about it. The number of offspring keeps doubling. Some bacteria can reproduce in as little as 20 minutes if they have the right conditions. So within 20 minutes, one cell would split into two. 40 minutes, the two would split into four, and so on. So 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32. In 8 hours, the original cell will have multiplied nearly 17 million new bacteria. Okay, now remember, number one, bacteria is microscopic, so don't get freaked out. Number two, of course, conditions usually do not remain right for reproduction to go at that rate. So this sometimes happens, guys, when we get sick. The bacteria reproduce too fast in our bodies to balance it out right, and it makes us sick. Okay, over here, guys, there are different forms of asexual reproduction. Different types of mitosis, how cells split. The first one is fission. Parent cells split to produce two offspring cells. So we're cutting them in half. That's literally what fission means. Fission means to split. What's a living creature that does that? Bacteria reproduce that way. Okay? Next paragraph. Yeast, some plants, and Hydra, this is Hydra, on the left produce asexually by a process called budding. During this process, a cell in the parent's body produces a small version of the parent. Many buds can form on a single parent, and then each bud has DNA identical to parent. So you can see this little guy growing off here, and eventually this bud's going to fall off, and it's its own living thing. So this Hydra here split off a bud, drops it, grows a new one. What your science book said is, remember, we can form many of those at the same time, okay? So I got a small little version, and then it splits off and drops. Over in your notes, budding. Parent produces a smaller version, and it drops off. Yeast is one, Hydra is another one. Okay, so we're keeping these different types of asexual reproduction straight and giving ourselves examples that go along with it. Number 3 down here, forming spores is another kind of asexual reproduction. A spore is a reproductive cell that has a nucleus and a little cytoplasm. A hard coat covers most spores. This coat protects the spore when conditions in the environment might be harmful. Okay, so some plants produce spores, and then they drop these spores out of them onto the ground. But lots of times plants, like let's go to a tree, which is not a spore, guys, but if you have the oak tree we talked about on the last page, drops its acorn. It drops its acorn in the fall. And that seed coat that they're talking about here doesn't rot until the spring. And so what that seed coat does is it protects it when the environment is harmful to it. I don't want a plant to start to grow in the fall, because it'll start to grow and then winter is going to hit, and winter would kill that plant. So what the seed coat does, it says, I'm going to stay frozen, and in the spring, when there's enough sunlight and oxygen and water and heat, boom, then I start to grow. So that's what a spore can do. So spores, reproductive cells that have a little bit of cytoplasm. Molds are one that they talked about coming up in here, and then I added mosses and ferns. You're going to need that when you get into your assignment. They'll ask you what reproduces, how do mosses and ferns reproduce? They reproduce with spores. When conditions are right, then, a spore develops into a new individual that has the same DNA as the parent. Most organisms that reproduce by spores produce many spores at the same time. Molds reproduce by forming spores. Spores are light, so they are easily spread by the wind. So you can see God in his wisdom, when he put that with some plants, says the wind can carry them away. We don't want to grow right next to our parent. Obviously, we'd be fighting for the same nutrients, okay? An example of molds being reproduced by spores as they spread all over the bread. Okay, Up here, some sea stars can reproduce asexually by forming new individuals from body parts. In the past, oyster fishers tried to protect their oyster beds from sea stars that ate the oysters. The fishers would capture the sea stars, chop them into pieces, and then throw them back into the water. The problem only got worse. Many of the chopped up parts of the sea stars grew into new individuals. Soon, there were many more sea stars than before, and the fishers began chopping them up. Now, guys, there's a few things I want to point out to you here. Number one, the word many, which means, can I chop up a sea star and kill it? Yes. But if I took a sea star and just cut one leg off of it and threw it back in, there's a good chance that it would reproduce. Okay, so what they're getting at is obviously they're capable of dying. Sometimes you read that like, you can't kill them, you just keep chopping up and they become more and more. That's not the case. But number two, you get a picture of this growing off of body parts. So it's kind of interesting. Next paragraph. In a similar way, new plants can grow from pieces of a plant. Did you ever see a potato that starts to look like that thing down there? It's begun to sprout like one shown on this page. The buds form on the plant through the process of mitosis. Okay, so cells are splitting. We have new ones growing. Each bud can be cut from the plant and planted. It will grow into a new potato plant. In a similar way, many weeds can grow a whole new plant from just a small bit of a root that a gardener misses. Anyone ever tried to get rid of dandelions by pulling them out? Soon learns that. So guys, what they're getting at is if I grab a dandelion and I yank to pull a dandelion out and I break the plant off, I didn't get its roots. Next week, those roots are going to reproduce a new dandelion, okay? Lots of weeds do that, part of the curse of man. Okay, potatoes, when you get a potato and it's obviously not growing anything, guys, they have those little indents. They're called eyes on the potato. You cut those little eyes and plant in the ground. It'll grow new potato plants, new potato plants. So farmers will take a potato like this and they'll cut it up into each of these little pieces here and then stick that little piece in there. What the plant is doing, guys, is it's literally living off of the rest of the potato here. That's where it's getting its nutrients as it goes and it starts a plant. So number one, this is the process of mitosis from chapter 2. And then you have your two examples, an animal example of sea stars and a plant example of potatoes that grow from body parts. These are all types of asexual reproduction. The key today, guys, asexual reproduction. One parent, identical DNA. There will be no variance. Sexual reproduction is going to give us the variance that we're going to talk about coming up. All right, you got an assignment that goes along with your notes from lesson 1 with the review. Take your time with that and make sure you got those answers, those questions answered correctly. Blessings.